Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive.
It's great to be diving in today.
Absolutely. Today, we're not just exploring a topic. We're really taking a journey into how we actually understand things, how we make sense of the world, and maybe how we sometimes get a bit stuck in our own ways of seeing. We're going to challenge a really deep assumption, I think. The idea that our best thinking tools are the ones we keep forever.
Right. The permanent ones.
Exactly. But what if? What if the deepest insights actually come when we learn to let go of the very frameworks that helped us get there in the first place?
It's a fascinating, almost counterintuitive idea.
It really is. It's like an invitation to rethink our whole approach to knowledge, to see the value of a tool, not just for what it helps us build, but for the higher place it lets us climb to.
Indeed. And the source material for our deep dive today is a really thought-provoking piece by Harish. It's titled Wittgenstein's Ladder, Abandoning Tools for Deeper Understanding. Now, Harish is a lifelong learner, really passionate about reflection, exploration. His writing shares these sharp insights on cybernetics, systems thinking, lean, statistics, a whole range.
Sounds like our kind of thinker.
Definitely. He's also active in CyberSyn. That's a really vibrant community with exclusive resources, books, podcasts, forums, the whole deal. His writing has this reflective, precise quality.
Right.
And our job today really is to unpack those ideas, make them accessible, engaging, bring them to life a bit.
Okay, so the mission is clear. We're digging into this powerful, kind of paradoxical idea that some of our most vital thinking tools aren't meant to be kept forever. They're actually designed, or maybe best used, with the idea that we'll eventually leave them behind.
Like the ladder.
Exactly like the ladder. You absolutely need it to climb up, to get to that higher viewpoint. But once you're there, once you've actually made the ascent, you have to, toss it away.
It sounds drastic when you put it like that.
It does. But it's not about being wasteful with knowledge or, intellectually lazy. It's about seeing the limits built into our frameworks and then transcending those limits to get to a deeper, more participatory kind of understanding, especially when things get really complex.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, this whole idea really challenges some bedrock assumptions we have about objectivity, doesn't it? About how we try to, map reality. It offers a path towards what's often called second-order understanding.
Okay, second-order understanding. What's that briefly?
It's a more nuanced, reflective way of knowing, one that consciously folds in our own role, acknowledges that we're shaping the reality we're observing. It's about, understanding the process of understanding itself.
Gotcha. Understanding. Let's dive in. So let's start with the quote that gives this whole thing its name. It's from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. In his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he wrote this: "My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. When he has used them as steps to climb beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it."
Nonsensical. That's a strong word.
It really is. It sounds jarring.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how can ideas that enlighten you end up being nonsensical? Seems contradictory. But here's the key insight, the thing Harish really brings out. Wittgenstein isn't saying the propositions are inherently meaningless, like just gibberish.
Right. Not useless from the start.
No. It's about their function. They're like temporary scaffolds, steps on that ladder. They're designed specifically to help you get somewhere higher, reach a new perspective, a deeper level of understanding.
Okay.
Once you're there, once you've truly grasped the insight they were pointing towards, the ladder itself, those specific propositions, those initial ideas, they just aren't needed anymore. Not in their original form, anyway.
So clinging to them actually holds you back.
Yeah, exactly. Holding on to that ladder for dear life after you've reached the top, it might actually stop you from going further. They did their job. Now you got to let them go.
And this metaphor, this idea of the ladder, it becomes really powerful when we think about complexity, right? Situations where our usual ways of thinking just fall short.
How so?
Well, traditional sort of static approaches often fail because they don't really grasp the dynamic, interconnected nature of complex systems. And crucially, they don't account for our own role within those systems.
Okay.
The latter, in this context, becomes this essential tool for moments when we need to move beyond those simplistic, fixed ways of seeing things. It lets us get to a vantage point where the original framework itself looks different, maybe limited, maybe something to transcend, not just hold on to as the final truth.
Makes sense.
Now, Harish, in another piece he wrote, talks about what he calls the two dogmas of complexity science.
Dogmas. Okay, strong word again. What are they?
There are these deeply embedded beliefs, assumptions we often don't even question, that can actually hinder a deeper understanding of complexity. The first one is ontological complexity realism.
Ontological complexity realism. Break that down for us.
It's basically the belief that complexity is just out there in the world, like an objective property of a system, something you can measure, totally independent of us, the observers.
So Hirsch is saying we treat complexity like a rock. It's just there, being complex, whether we look at it or not. It's a feature of the thing itself that we can just, measure from the outside without affecting it.
Precisely. It assumes this fixed external reality of complexity. And the second dogma he points to is epistemological representationalism.
Okay, epistemological representationalism. And that is?
That's the belief that our main job, our primary goal when trying to understand something complex, is to create these neutral, objective representations, like perfect maps of that out there complexity. Ah, okay. So it's like trying to draw that perfect map of the jungle. We assume we can capture its true essence, and the act of mapping itself doesn't change the jungle, or even how we see the jungle. We're aiming for this flawless mirror image, assuming the mirror itself is invisible.
You've got it. And these dogmas stick around because, well, they're comforting, right? They give us this illusion of control, of objectivity. They let us believe we can stand apart from a complex system, model it perfectly, manage it, predict its behavior. It maintains that sense of intellectual distance, maybe even authority.
But Harris argues that's an illusion.
Right. And he says overcoming these dogmas requires something kind of paradoxical. It requires conceptual tools that we must eventually abandon.
Wait, so we need tools to understand the limits of tools. Exactly. We actually have to use these frameworks, these tools, to get to the point where we see their own limitations. It's like like using a map to learn a city so well that you eventually realize, this map is just one way to see this city, and you don't actually need that specific map anymore to find your way around. You've internalized the terrain in a deeper way.
That's a really profound thought. It's almost unsettling, isn't it, to think that our standard approach, trying to draw that perfect objective map of something complex, might actually be hindering us. That our very effort to gain control through mapping might be keeping us from a richer understanding. Wow. It really makes me think about my own life, When I try to map a tricky situation, maybe a conflict or a big decision, how often do I cling to my initial map, hoping it'll give me certainty, even when things are obviously shifting or new information comes in that doesn't quite fit? It's like trying to navigate downtown rush hour with a map from 1950. It just doesn't work anymore. Hashtag check 2. The reentry problem in complexity.
And what's really fascinating here, often the core challenge in complexity stems from something we tend to gloss over. You simply can't separate the observer from what's being observed.
Okay.
George Spencer Brown, in his work Laws of Form, introduced this critical concept of reentry.
Reentry.
He basically said, when talking about complexity, we often overlook the point that the observer cannot be separated from what they observe. Every single attempt we make to map or measure complexity actually changes the relationship between the observer and the system, and that change, in turn, changes the complexity itself.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. So reentry. To simply put, it's when a distinction, like a boundary we draw, kind of folds back on itself. Can you give us an analogy? Because it sounds really abstract. It feels like the very act of looking at something or defining it actually changes the thing itself. Like we're never neutral observers.
Exactly. You're never truly neutral. Your presence, the questions you ask, the categories you use, they all become part of the system you're examining. Think about it like this. Imagine trying to measure the temperature of a very small shot glass of water with a big, chunky, warm thermometer.
Okay.
The very act of putting that thermometer into the water changes the water's temperature, right? Even as you're trying to get an accurate reading. The distinction you're making, water, thermometer, it's useful, sure, but the boundary isn't sealed. The thermometer re-enters the system it's trying to measure. That's re-entry in a nutshell.
Okay, the thermometer example helps. So it's always happening, this re-entry.
In complex systems, yes, significantly. And why this matters is huge. It fundamentally blows up the whole idea of purely objective measurement. It highlights our active, unavoidable role in actually shaping what we perceive as complex. We're not just passive spectators watching a show.
Right.
And this recursion, this looping back of our observation into the system, here puts it perfectly. It's not a bug to be fixed, but a feature of complexity itself.
A feature, not a bug. I like that. It's just how these systems work.
Exactly. It's woven into their very fabric.
Now, Harish gives a really clear example of this using something called the Ashby space framework. I think this is used in systems thinking, right? To look at an organization's capacity for variety.
That's right. You might try to plot an organization on these axes, say, variety of stimuli it faces from its environment and variety of responses it can generate.
Okay.
But Harris points out, the moment you try this, we encounter reentry. He asks these killer questions that just expose the whole loop. Who decides where the organization sits on the variety of stimuli axis?
The organization itself, based on what it pays attention to.
Exactly. Through its own distinction-making processes. And then, what counts as variety of responses?
Again, it depends on what the observer or maybe the organization itself considers a meaningful action, right?
Precisely. It depends entirely on the distinctions the observer can even make about what counts as meaningful action.
So the framework can't escape this loop.
It can't. As Harish says, it cannot escape this recursion. It tries to treat these dynamic, subjective processes like deciding what's a stimulus or what's a relevant response as if they're just objective quantities you can measure. But the very act of defining and applying those categories is itself an act of distinction-making. And that act influences what you then observe. The categories aren't just sitting out there waiting for you. They're actively co-created by the observer and the system interacting.
Okay, so if the simple act of measuring or categorizing an organization's variety actually shapes what we see as variety, this isn't just a problem for the Ashby framework, is it? It feels like a fundamental challenge to the idea that we can ever make a truly objective model of any complex living system. What does this do to our idea of data-driven decisions? Is objective data always kind of shaped by our perspective?
It absolutely raises that question, yeah. And connecting this more broadly, re-entry exposes these deep internal contradictions in systems that try to maintain really rigid boundaries, those first-order distinctions that ignore the observer. Harish mentions his post on the form of decency, and he uses the powerful example of xenophobic ideologies. He notes that when xenophobic ideologies apply their own criteria to themselves, when the form folds back, they collapse under their internal logic. Think about it. They create these rigid distinctions, right? Criteria for who belongs, who's excluded.
Right, us versus them.
But if you consistently turn those same criteria back onto the us group, rigorously apply their own rules to themselves, the whole thing often unravels. It exposes inconsistencies, self-contradictions.
So the very logic they use to exclude others, if applied universally, would actually undermine their own group's coherence. Wow. The system eats itself, logically speaking.
Exactly. It's a general dynamic. The same kind of collapse happens when complexity frameworks try to objectively map the very processes of distinction-making that generate the complexity in the first place. When a tool tries to objectively map the subjective act of mapping, it hits its own limits. Why this matters is it shows that these self-referential systems, when forced to confront their own internal logic, can just unravel. It reveals the inherent instability of those rigid first-order distinctions, the ones that pretend they exist separate from the observer, immune to the act of observation.
Wow. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting and, yeah, a bit mind-bending. This idea that our tools, our frameworks, can't escape influencing what they measure. It's like that thermometer changing the water temperature. But maybe the water is also bubbling differently because the thermometer is there. It seriously makes you question anything presented as objective data or analysis. When you look at a report, a chart, a model, how often do you just forget that someone with their own specific lens, their own thermometer, put it together, and that their active creation might have subtly shifted the very reality it claims to just represent? Makes you wonder what's left out, or even changed, just by the attempt to map it. Why reentry creates a need for ladders. Okay, so this leads us to a really big challenge, right? If our tools for understanding complexity are caught up in these reentry loops, if our observations keep changing the thing we observe and vice versa, then how on earth do we develop better ways of thinking about complex systems? We can't just ditch all conceptual tools. We'd be lost swimming in chaos.
Right. We'd have no way to make sense of anything.
But we also can't just treat them as neutral, objective maps, because we know now they aren't. So what's the path forward? Where do we go?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is precisely where Harish argues that ladder consciousness becomes essential.
Ladder consciousness, okay.
He says it becomes necessary when we engage with situations in ways that generate significant recursive coupling between observer and observed.
Recursive coupling. Let's unpack that term. It sounds important.
It really is. Essentially, it's when our distinction making substantially shapes what we are trying to understand, think about it as a loop. When our interventions change the system, which changes us, which changes our interventions, it's that continuous back and forth dance where everything is intertwined.
Okay, let me see if I can break that down. Recursive coupling is like, step one, my questions or actions change the system I'm looking at.
Right.
Step two, the system's reaction to my changes then affects my understanding or my next move. And step three, that then shapes my next intervention, which changes the system again, and it just keeps going. A continuous feedback loop where observer and observed are constantly co-creating the situation.
That's a perfect way to put it. And in those kinds of situations, Harris says, treating our models as stable representations becomes counterproductive. They just can't keep up. They give you this false sense of stability, making you think you've got a handle on something that's constantly shifting under your feet.
Right.
He uses a great analogy to make this clear. Consider the difference between using a roadmap to navigate familiar streets versus using a systems model to understand organizational dynamics.
Okay, the roadmap. That seems pretty straightforward. Like you said, the roadmap engages with relatively stable relationships, such as the streets that rarely change position because we are looking at the map. Me looking at the map doesn't make Elm Street suddenly reroute itself.
Exactly. It's a fairly stable first-order kind of interaction. The map represents a mostly unchanging reality, at least in the short term.
But organizational modeling, that's different.
Totally different. He says, organizational systems modeling involves high degrees of recursive coupling. Why? Because the very process of creating models changes how participants see their organization, which changes how they behave, which changes the organizational dynamics, which requires updating the models. The model isn't just a snapshot, it's an active player in the game.
So the model itself becomes an intervention.
Yes. The act of modeling changes the thing being modeled.
So in these highly recursive situations, the map isn't just showing the territory. It's actively altering the territory while we're trying to read it. It's not just a guide, it's an ingredient in the organizational soup.
Precisely. And why this is so crucial is that it highlights that in these situations, our models have to be seen as dynamic, as temporary. They must become ladders. They simply cannot function as permanent reference points because both the observer, the modeler, and the system being modeled are co-evolving through the modeling process itself. Everything is changing together.
Okay, so this is where Wittgenstein's ladder comes back in so powerfully. It offers us a way to use conceptual tools while remaining aware of their provisional nature. We need frameworks, right? We need something to start with, to structure our thinking about complexity.
Absolutely. We can't think without some structure.
But crucially, we also need ways to transcend the limits of those same frameworks, to avoid getting stuck on that ladder rung. The ladder is that mechanism. It helps us climb, but it also embodies the idea of letting go.
And the way the ladder works, Harris points out, is through what looks like a paradox, maybe even a contradiction. He says, we use conceptual distinctions to develop awareness of the limitations of conceptual distinctions.
Say that again. We use distinctions to see the limits of distinction.
Exactly. We might use a framework like Ashby space, not because it gives us the perfect objective truth about an organization's variety, but because the process of using it, grappling with it, can actually help us recognize how our own ways of making distinctions shape what we see as complex. The framework becomes a mirror, reflecting back our own sense-making habits, our own observational biases.
That's a killer insight. The latter helps us use the tool to understand how we are using the tool and the impact that usage has. The tool reveals its own provisional nature by being used thoughtfully.
Precisely. And this whole way of thinking connects directly to what Heinz von Forster called second-order cybernetics.
Okay, von Forster, second-order cybernetics.
Which is essentially, as he put it, observing observation.
Observing observation, meta.
Very meta. And it's different from first-order thinking, which, as we've seen, assumes we can step outside the system and create objective maps. Second-order thinking starts from a different place. It recognizes that we are already participants in the systems we are trying to understand. We're never truly outside looking in through a one-way mirror.
We're in the soup.
We're in the soup. And this connection matters because the latter is really a practical tool, a manifestation of second-order cybernetics in action. It allows us to become consciously aware of our own role, our own participation in shaping what we perceive as complexity. It's about understanding our own understanding in relation to the world.
So where does this leave us? It really feels like a fundamental shift, doesn't it? Almost like admitting humbly that our maps will never be perfect, and that's okay. In fact, maybe it's necessary. Maybe the real value isn't in the map's static accuracy, but in how the process of mapping helps us see how we map, how we draw lines, make distinctions, and how that shapes everything. It makes me wonder, how often do we mistake our map for the only territory in relationships, career choices, even how we see ourselves? And what happens when we do that? Do we just become rigid, brittle, unable to adapt when reality inevitably throws us a curveball? Or when someone else shows up with a totally different but maybe equally valid map? It's a call for some real intellectual humility. Okay, let's try and bring this down to earth a bit. How does this latter consciousness actually work in practice? Harish gives a great example from organizational consulting. Let's walk through that.
Sounds good. Imagine consultants facilitating a systems mapping exercise in a company.
Okay, drawing diagrams of how things connect, who reports to whom, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Now, a typical, maybe first-order approach would be to treat the final diagram as if it represents the real organizational structure, like a fixed blueprint. The main goal becomes improving the accuracy of that map, making sure it perfectly mirrors the supposed truth of the organization, as if the organization is just sitting there, unchanging, waiting to be mapped.
Right, get the map right.
But if we're in a situation with significant recursive coupling, remember, where the mapping process itself starts changing how people see things, how they act, how the organization actually functions, then latter consciousness suggests a totally different game.
Because the map isn't just a snapshot anymore.
Exactly. The act of creating it, discussing it, arguing about it, that changes the system in real time.
So the value of the map shifts completely. Harish says the map becomes valuable not when it accurately represents the organization, but when the mapping process helps participants recognize how their own distinction-making participates in creating organizational dynamics.
Precisely. The goal shifts from getting the perfect picture to fostering awareness about how the picture is being painted and who's holding the brush. We use the tool, the map, to develop meta-awareness of how we collectively complexify organizational life. It's about seeing our own fingerprints all over the supposed reality.
That really flips the script on the questions we ask then.
Totally. Instead of asking, is our systems map accurate, which is that first order question, we ask, how does the process of creating this map reveal and reshape our current ways of making distinctions about organizational life? It reframes the whole purpose. And in this sense, the tool, the map, it has this inherently disposable quality like the latter. Harish notes, the tool serves its purpose when it points beyond itself toward the processes that we participate in creating organizational reality, then becomes disposable once we have developed more direct awareness of our participation. It's not about keeping the map on the wall forever. It's about the insight gained through the mapping.
And you're saying this isn't just for consultants drawing org charts, right? This applies much more broadly.
Absolutely. This principle cuts across complexity frameworks, scientific modeling, social analysis, policymaking, you name it. When we use any analytical tool, latter consciousness means recognizing that we are not discovering objective properties, but enacting particular ways of making sense that bring certain possibilities into view while obscuring others. Every tool is a lens, and every lens highlights some things and hides others.
Okay.
So the ultimate usefulness of any framework, Harish suggests, isn't in its final static output, the definitive answer, the perfect model. Instead, the framework becomes useful when we can use it to examine our own sense-making, then let it go. It's about introspection, self-awareness, and ultimately transcendence, not just accumulating representations. It's about building our capacity for understanding, not just collecting maps.
This really makes me pause. It really is. Like the map isn't the destination. The journey of making it is where the real learning happens. And the treasure isn't the map itself, but the awareness we gain about how we navigate, how we are part of the landscape we're mapping. How could this apply to, say, a tough project at work or maybe a difficult conversation you keep having? Are you stuck trying to perfect your map of the situation and get the other person to accept it? Or could you use the process of trying to understand together to gain insight into how you are shaping the dynamic, how your engagement is part of the problem, or maybe part of the solution? It feels like a shift from needing to be right to needing to understand my role in what's happening. That's subtle, but huge. Okay, so this leads to the next big question, doesn't it? What actually happens after we kick away the ladder? Once the tools have served their purpose, once we've transcended their limits, what's left? Is it just nothing? An intellectual void, free fall?
It's a great question. And Harish argues, no, it's not an absence of structure. It's a different relationship to structure. It's about shifting away from rigid, fixed frameworks towards something more Well, more dynamic, more adaptive, more deeply involved.
Okay.
He introduces what John Dewey called inquiry. Inquiry is seen as a more fluid, responsive way of engaging with situations that draws on conceptual resources without being constrained by them.
So it's not like we forget everything or abandon all knowledge. We just hold it differently, more flexibly.
Yeah.
More a lot like resources we can draw on, not rules we have to follow.
Exactly. And Dewey's idea of inquiry is super relevant here because, Hirsch notes, it transcends the subject-object dualism that creates many of our analytical problems.
That split between me in here and the world out there.
Right. That idea that there's an objective world completely separate from a subjective observer. Dewey saw thinking differently. Instead of treating thinking as something that happens inside our heads while we observe an external world, he saw inquiry as this transactional process between organism and environment. The inquirer and the situation being inquired into are not separate things. They're parts of a single unfolding transaction.
Like a dance.
Exactly. A continuous, evolving dance, not just watching from the sidelines.
So inquiry isn't just about making a better representation of reality. It's about actively transforming situations, moving from problematic states to more settled, more workable ones. It's about action, not just observation.
Precisely. It's engaged transformation. And this connects right back to that idea of complexifying as a verb, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. We're not just finding complexity, we're doing it.
Right. When we encounter what we call a complex situation, inquiry suggests we are not discovering complexity out there, but participating in an ongoing transaction that we might call complexifying. As Harris puts it, the situation becomes complex through our engagement with it, just as we become complex through our engagement with the situation. It's this active, reciprocal generation of the very complexity we're experiencing. It's a verb, an action, a dynamic process of interaction, not just a noun describing a static property.
And Dewey's famous idea of learning by doing seems crucial here too, but not just doing plus reflection. Right?
Absolutely. We act, observe the consequences, and adjust our future actions based on what we learn. It creates this recursive cycle where understanding evolves through engagement, not detached analysis. The goal isn't some final static truth or the perfect unchanging map. The goal is to develop more intelligent ways of acting within ongoing situations.
Okay, and this naturally brings in ladder consciousness.
It does, because in this view, we use conceptual tools as hypotheses for action rather than as final descriptions of reality. We try them out. We test these tools against their consequences in lived experience, keeping those that prove helpful and abandoning those that constrain effective action. The tools become servants to inquiry, aids to exploration, not the final word.
So what does this kind of post-ladder engagement, this inquiry, feel like? What are its qualities? Harris gives us not a definitive checklist, but he calls it an intuition pump, some characteristics to get a feel for it.
Yeah, the first quality he highlights is responsiveness over methodology.
Okay, what's that mean?
It means instead of just blindly grabbing a predetermined framework or sticking rigidly to a method for every situation, we cultivate this sensitivity, this awareness of what this particular situation seems to be calling for. We keep our toolkit handy, all those different conceptual ladders, but we remain free to set them aside when they aren't helping right now. It's about adapting fluidly, letting the context guide the tools, not forcing a tool onto the context.
It sounds like a kind of intellectual agility, like a jazz musician improvising rather than just playing the sheet music note for note.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
The second quality is process awareness. This means becoming much more conscious of how our own sense-making, our own ways of cutting up the world and making distinctions, actively participates in creating the realities we experience.
Okay.
Now, this isn't about saying anything goes or there's no shared reality. It's more aligned with what Donna Haraway called situated knowledge. It's understanding that all knowledge comes from somewhere, from a particular perspective, and acknowledging that positionality. Knowing that how we see things is shaped by where we stand and that awareness changes how we act.
Right, knowing your lens.
Exactly. And the third quality Harris mentions is provisional commitment. This is really key. It allows us to act decisively, confidently, based on our current best understanding, our best hypothesis right now, while also staying genuinely open to revising that understanding as new information comes in or the situation changes.
Okay.
It's like having a second-order wisdom, Harris says, an intuition about the limits of your own knowledge, even while you're acting on it. You move forward with conviction, but also with humility, always testing your ideas against reality.
This is where it gets really practical and interesting. This shift from rigid tools to this fluid inquiry. It really does sound like embracing a dance with reality, not trying to impose a fixed blueprint, moving from needing certainty to embracing engaged curiosity. Okay, think about this. What's one area in your life right now where you could maybe experiment with this? Less rigid plan, more learning by doing and reflection. Maybe it's a creative project, maybe navigating a tricky relationship, maybe even tackling a personal goal. What if you approached it less like a problem with a single right answer demanding a fixed method, and more like a situation to be inquired into through adaptive action and paying attention? That feels different.
Yeah.
#tag6, the ethics of temporary tools. Now, this whole exploration of the temporary nature of our tools, it inevitably brings up some really deep ethical questions, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Harish connects this back to his points about reentry and even the dangers inherent in rigid ideologies like xenophobia. The core ethical point seems to be this. When we hold our conceptual tools too tightly, we risk treating our provisional distinctions as absolute truths, our temporary boundaries as permanent walls.
Hardening of the categories.
Exactly. And Harry says this is one of the main reasons why we must discard the latter rather than hold on to it. If we mistake the latter, our current framework, our current truth for the ultimate destination, we risk turning it into a weapon, using it to exclude or harm.
The latter, then, teaches us this fundamentally different stance towards our beliefs, our frameworks. A stance that is, as Harris puts it, firm enough to guide action, light enough to avoid becoming weapons. That balance sounds crucial.
It does. Let's unpack that. Firm enough to guide action. What does that really mean? We can't just be paralyzed by doubt all the time, right?
No, exactly. It means we have to be able to act, to make decisions based on our current understanding. Even while we hold the awareness that this understanding is provisional, it might change. Without some degree of commitment to our frameworks, our current best maps, we'd just be stuck, paralyzed by infinite self-questioning.
We'd never do anything.
Right. We need enough conviction to move forward, to make choices, to take responsibility for our actions. That firmness gives us agency. It lets us act in the world.
Okay, that makes sense. Need conviction to act. But then the other side, holding these same beliefs lightly enough to avoid weaponizing them, that feels like the trickier part of the balancing act. What does that look like?
This gets into maintaining what the poet John Keats called negative capability.
Negative capability. Okay.
It's the ability to remain in uncertainty and doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. It means cultivating the humility to recognize that, yeah, our strongest convictions might actually be wrong, our clearest insights. Maybe they're only partial, our most beloved frameworks. Maybe they're limiting us in ways we can't even see yet.
Like being okay with not knowing everything, for sure.
Exactly. It's the ability to sit with ambiguity, with contradiction, with uncertainty, without immediately needing to resolve it or shut it down. Think about a scientist whose data contradicts a cherished theory. Negative capability is staying with that uncomfortable data, exploring it, rather than instantly dismissing it or forcing it to fit the old theory. It's letting the uncertainty itself guide you towards potentially deeper understanding, even if it means letting go of something you thought was true.
That is a real challenge, isn't it? It's like this paradox of act with conviction, take a stand based on what you know now, but always be ready for that conviction to be gently questioned or maybe even completely overturned by new experience. It's walking a tightrope between commitment and openness.
That's a perfect image for it. And the latter helps us walk that tightrope. As Harish says, we must act as if our current understanding is enough to work with, while remaining open to its revision. We must commit without clinging. We must form strong opinions, but hold them lightly. That delicate balance, that's really the heart of engaging ethically with complexity. Be confident in your step, but keep scanning the horizon.
And this balance becomes super important when we're interacting with other people, right?
Yeah.
Especially people who see the world differently, who hold different frameworks.
Hugely important. Instead of getting bogged down in those battles over whose map is more accurate, which is usually a losing game for everyone, latter consciousness invites something different. It invites us to explore how these different ways of making sense might serve different purposes or illuminate different aspects of a complex reality we all share. It encourages us to treat our own frameworks less like territory to defend and more like, well, like offerings to collective inquiry, contributions, not final answers.
That really shifts how we might approach disagreement, doesn't it? From argument aimed at winning to exploration aimed at understanding.
It does. And the ethical imperative here, Harish connects it directly to von Forster's principle. Act always so as to increase the number of choices.
Piece choices, okay.
When we hold our own tools lightly, we automatically create space for others to contribute their own sense-making resources, their own perspectives, their own maps. When we consciously avoid weaponizing our frameworks, we keep possibilities open instead of shutting them down. And that's just fundamental for genuine collaboration, for innovation, for building a richer, more robust collective grasp of things.
So our role shifts. We're not meant to be the expert with the one true map. We're meant to be something else, more like a facilitator.
Yeah, exactly. Our role, viewed this way, becomes less about providing definitive maps and more about helping develop capacities for making better distinctions in the face of uncertainty. It suggests designing our interactions, our projects, our conversations in ways that intentionally increase the number of choices, as Von Forster put it, rather than funneling everyone towards one predetermined solution. It's about empowering others to navigate the complexity themselves, fostering their own inquiry, not just handing them your map and telling them to follow it.
Wow. So thinking about this today, that idea of negative capability, being okay with uncertainty and committing without clinging, it really lands. It feels like such a mature, powerful way to engage with the world. Having conviction, but also genuine curiosity. Acting decisively, but staying humble enough to learn and adapt. How could you, personally, practice holding one of your strong beliefs or opinions just a bit more lightly today? Allowing space for new information or another perspective to challenge or enrich it, rather than immediately feeling like you have to defend it. Feels like a lifelong practice, really. Hashtag 7. Climbing toward participatory knowing. Complexity is a verb.
Oh.
Okay, so this whole journey seems to bring us right back around, full circle, to Harish's initial critique of those dogmas of complexity science.
Yeah.
You know, that complexity is just out there, and we can objectively map it. But now we can see it with this extra layer, this transformative insight that actually shifts how we even use the word complexity. We usually use it as a noun, right? This system has complexity, or an adjective. This is a complex situation, like as a property of the thing itself.
Right. Static, external.
But Harish argues it may be time to recognize complexity as a verb, something we do, rather than something we just encounter.
That's a huge shift.
Yeah.
From a property to an action.
Yeah. So instead of complexity being like the system's weight or color, it's an action that we're involved in creating through how we engage with it.
Yeah.
We're not just observing complexity, we're actively complexifying.
Exactly. When we complexify a situation, Harish explains it like this.
Yeah.
We're not discovering pre-existing complexity, but participating in an ongoing process of distinction-making and sense-making that brings complexity into being. It's deeply reciprocal.
Yeah.
The situation becomes complex through our engagement with it, just as we become complex through our engagement with the situation.
Okay.
This dynamic recursive interaction, this back and forth between knowing systems like us and their environments, is what Harish terms epistemic coupling.
Epistemic coupling.
It's this continuous co-creative dance where we and the world we perceive are constantly shaping each other.
This verb idea fits so well with Dewey's transactional thinking we talked about, and Spencer Brown's focus on the observer creating distinctions. It suggests that when we say, wow, this situation is complex, maybe it's more accurate to say, wow, we are complexifying our relationship with this situation through the specific ways we're choosing to look at it and interact with it. It puts our own agency, our participation, right back in the center. Active agents, not passive viewers.
And this reframing has really practical implications for how we tackle challenges. Instead of the standard question, how can we manage this complex system, which assumes it's a separate thing out there to be managed, we might ask something different. We might ask, how are we complexifying this situation right now, and how could we complexify it differently?
That shifts the focus entirely, from an external problem to an internal participatory process we're involved in.
Exactly. Instead of seeing complexity as just a problem to be solved, we recognize complexifying as this ongoing process we're actively participating in creating. We become co-creators of the situations we're in, which means we also have agency in how they evolve.
And this view loops right back to ladder consciousness, connecting all these threads. If complexity really emerges from these observer-system interactions, from this epistemic coupling, well, then studying complexity must include studying how we study complexity.
You can't get outside of it.
Right. We can't step outside the very coupling that generates the complexity in the first place.
Yeah.
We're always part of the loop, influencing and being influenced.
And that's why the ladder metaphor is so useful here. It gives us a way to work with this recursion constructively. Harris says it allows us to use conceptual tools to bootstrap ourselves into metacognitive awareness, that ability to see our own thinking, then abandon those tools once they have served their purpose of revealing our own participation in constructing what we take to be reality. The latter helps us see our own handprints on the world, see our role in the complexity, and then, having gained that vital insight, walk more freely, more consciously, without needing the original scaffold anymore.
What's so fascinating here, and really feels like a game changer, is this idea that we're not just passive observers of complexity, but active participants in complexifying things through our very engagement. It makes us, well, active creators, not just sideline spectators of the challenges we face. It's like finding out you're not just watching the play, you're actually on stage, influencing the plot with every move you make. How does that shift your sense of responsibility when you're up against something that feels overwhelmingly complex? Does it feel more empowering knowing you have a role in shaping it? Or maybe a bit daunting, realizing your own influence? For me, I think it's, yeah, maybe a bit of both, but ultimately it feels empowering. Hashtag tag outro.
So just to kind of wrap up our deep dive today, we've really journeyed through Wittgenstein's ladder, haven't we? Seeing it as this powerful metaphor for how we often need to use conceptual tools and then, crucially, abandon them when navigating complex situations. We explored how George Spencer Brown's idea of reentry fundamentally challenges our assumptions about objectivity, showing us that observer and observed are tangled together.
Yeah, inseparable.
Exactly. And we saw how cultivating meta-awareness helps us grasp our own significant role in complexifying the situations we encounter. This whole exploration really points towards the idea that deeper understanding often emerges not from rigidly clinging to our starting frameworks, but from transcending them, moving towards that more fluid, responsive, deeply participatory way of knowing that Dewey called inquiry.
And what comes out of all this, as Harris puts it so well, is a form of wisdom that seems well suited to our current historical moment. A wisdom he describes as recursive and reflective, provisional and purposeful. These aren't just abstract terms. They feel like invitations to a richer, maybe more effective way of being in the world.
Let's briefly touch on those qualities again. Recursive wisdom. That's acknowledging we're always inside the systems we're trying to understand. Our attempts to make sense are part of the sense-making landscape itself. This leads to meta-learning, learning about how we learn, thinking about how we think, to include ourselves in our analyses, to observe our own observing. It's deep self-awareness folded into our understanding.
Yeah. And the reflective wisdom. This suggests that acting effectively in complex situations demands this ongoing, honest look at our own assumptions, our biases, our blind spots. But it's not about getting stuck in self-doubt. It's about the cultivation of the ability to think about what we are doing while we are doing it, to adjust our approach based on emerging feedback. It's dynamic self-correction, reflection, fueling better action.
Then provisional wisdom. Holding our current understanding as just that our current best guess, our strongest hypothesis for now, while staying genuinely open to revising it. Acting with conviction, yes, but maintaining that epistemic humility. It's embracing fallibilism, knowing that any perspective, however well supported, might be incomplete or wrong and must be tested against experience.
And finally, purposeful wisdom. This reminds us that our openness to revision isn't just random wandering. It's consciously directed towards some vision of better outcomes. Using our provisional understanding to work toward flourishing, justice, and expanded possibilities for everyone involved. It asks us to take responsibility for the worlds we help create through our actions, guiding our inquiry towards something better.
Taken together, these qualities really do outline an approach to complexity that feels both humble and decisive, doesn't it? Both open-minded and committed. It encourages us to use our best tools but hold them lightly, to think systematically but stay open to surprise, to act decisively but remain deeply curious about the consequences. It feels like a powerful path towards not just deeper understanding, but maybe a more graceful way to live in this messy, complex world.
Beautifully put.
And perhaps the most crucial takeaway, as Harris concludes, is the reminder that we are not outside observers of complex systems, but participants within them. The latter helps us climb up, get a clearer view of our own participation, and then, if we choose wisely, we can kick it away and engage more consciously with the complexity we help create. It really drives home that deeper understanding doesn't come from having perfect maps, but from developing better capacities for navigating, for inquiring, within largely unmapped territory.
What a profound and ultimately empowering thought to end on. If these ideas have sparked your curiosity as much as ours, we definitely encourage you to continue exploring. You can visit Harish's blog at harishsnotebook.wordpress.com.
Lots of great stuff there.
Yeah. And you can also check out the CyberSyn community. Harish is active there, and it's a fantastic resource for forums, books, and discussions. That's spelled CYB3RSYN.
CYB3RSYN.
Got it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Wittgenstein's ladder.
It's been a pleasure.
Stay curious and always keep on learning.